If wrestling has indeed pervaded the ether of everywhere, the most important part of everywhere nowadays is the algorithmic abyss that probes our brains, gathering data in order to sell us ideas and products, thereby changing us and everyone around us. Professor Lawrence Lessig has been writing about digital technology for 3 decades. When I met him, he and I both believed that social media could rescue democracy from the overlording influence of money and politics. But when he spoke in Berlin in February of 2024, he delivered a desperate, dire warning about a rising digital overlord.
We need to recognize that there is an intelligence out there to get us, because our perceptions, our collective perceptions, our collective misimpressions are not accidental. They are expected, they are intended, they are the product of the thing. Okay, I want to be careful introducing the thing. I'm going to talk a little bit about AI, but I'm not going to slag on AI. I think AI is the most extraordinary technology humanity has ever even conceived of, but I also think it has the potential to end humanity. But I'm not going to slag on AI because I'm pretty sure that our robot overlord is going to be listening to these TED Talks someday, and I don't want to be on the wrong side of the overlord, so AI is just fine. I'm not going to talk...
So congratulations. You have finally convinced me to be as afraid of AI as all the people who are smarter than me are.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I've never seen you so concerned, even when you talked about Republic Lost and the corrupting influence of money in politics. I've never seen you so concerned. Maybe you can explain to us why.
Well, I guess I'm really anxious that we've unleashed a technology that we've already seen has undermined our capacity for self-governance. Let's just start with the AI that's driving social media right now. What that AI is really good at is figuring out how to keep us engaged. And unfortunately for us, we are the sort of creatures that are going to be engaged by the worst sort of content. The content that makes us ignorant and angry and polarizes America. And so the point is, as that infrastructure seeps into everything that we do, it can't help but turn us into a dysfunctional, even more dysfunctional democracy.
When you wrote Remix, it sounded to me like you were saying there's a lot of hope in this ability for us to create culture collectively without the need for a giant corporation that controls television newscasts. And now you're saying, wow, we've kind of gone off the rails, and it sounds like you're more concerned about the direction social media is going right now than you were even about corporations controlling advertising about elections.
Yeah, that's a great insight. Yeah, I mean, you know, code was published 25 years ago. I feel like there's a lot I understood and I saw about the internet and was really anxious about the way it would evolve. The one thing I think all of us were oblivious to was the way algorithmic advertising would work. The Google boys didn't understand what advertising would do. I mean, you know, when they launched Google, about the time Remix came out, right? They launched Google promising that Google would not be an advertising-based search engine because advertising search distorted search. It wasn't giving consumers what they wanted. But, you know, very quickly, engineers inside of Google recognized the enormous potential for algorithmic advertising because they saw the extraordinary amount of data that people were basically giving to Google. You know, you search on something in Google and you pick the third or the fourth thing on the list, that tells them something. And so as they began to see all this data that they could gather from the internet, all of a sudden they have a business model for printing money. And that's what they did. They started printing money. And competitors came forward. So Facebook, you know, was like, we're actually going to be better than you at printing money because we know more about our customers than you do. Like, we know everything about them because they tell us everything about them in order to be a member of Facebook. So if you think you've got great targeting ads, we've got targeting ads even better. So this began this race to get as good as you possibly could in the algorithmic advertising business. We have corporations attempting to control their digital AI. But the reality of that control is not quite perfect. Facebook in September of 2017 was revealed to have a term in their ad system called Jew haters. You could buy ads targeting Jew haters. Now, nobody in Facebook created that category. There was not a human in Facebook who decided, we're going to start targeting Jew haters. It's AI created that category, because its AI figured Jew haters would be a profitable category for them to begin to sell ads to. And the company was, of course, embarrassed that it turned out they didn't actually have control over the machine that ran their machines that run our lives. The real difference in this story, though, is the extraordinary potential of this instrumentally rational entity versus us. So let's go back to Remix. Yes, Remix I was celebrating the technical capacity the internet was now handing everybody on the internet to create and share their content, their creativity. And against the background of a world where virality meant just what people wanted to share, that I think was a good thing, because people would share enormously creative things and they would be excited about sharing it. What none of us were thinking about, though, was what happens when you layer on top of it an algorithm whose objective is to maximize engagement, right? So, people talk about the internet, they say, oh my God, all these crazy conspiracy things are on the internet. The internet's producing all these crazy conspiracy things. There were just as many crazy conspiracies in AOL news groups, or Usenet news groups way back in the day, just as many. The difference is there wasn't a return from promoting that content. That the crazy content didn't earn you more money than the reflective, serious content. It was all the same. And the same thing with creativity here. Like the creativity that I was celebrating in Remix is just creativity. And like if it's good and you like it, you want to share it, you share it. But the things that get shared don't get shared because they are the most hate-filled stuff there is, or the stuff that's going to make people the most angry. It's only when the algorithms come onto the field and they start looking across the range of creativity and they say, you and you and you come to the front. Why? Not because you're smart or because you've got some sensitive view or understanding of some issue, or you can help people navigate some complicated subject. No, because your content is going to get people angry and it's going to get people to engage and to want to watch more and to go down rabbit holes of insanity. And so we're going to put you at front so that your stuff gets out there more than anybody else's stuff. And so the creator actually loses control over this. And YouTube was like, sorry, our business is feeding content that we think our customers will want. And at one level, that sounds great. Who wants to be fed stuff you don't want? But when we realize what the consequence of that is, being fed the stuff we want on the aggregate for the whole of society is turning us into crazy people who hate each other.
Well, you say that you hate NFL football. So at the risk of you ending the interview early, I'm going to bring up professional wrestling. Okay. Now, I'm sure you've never seen it, and you might not even be aware that Donald Trump is a WWE Hall of Famer.
Yes, I heard that.
Okay. But I watched it as a child, and so it carved a pathway in my brain so that I immediately recognized Donald Trump's professional wrestling antics when he actually first emerged as a birther. And I thought it was just a silly thing until I found out that there are actually academics writing books about that. And so now I've read them. I've started this podcast called Wrestling Darkness, and you're in episode number 4 right now. Then I read your article, The Age of the Fantasist, and I see a tremendous overlap between professional wrestling theatricality and the ability to craft a reality that fits the drama to maximize engagement, and not just Donald Trump, but the other fantasists that you write about, Kanye West, and actually that's another article that you cited, but Kanye West and Elon Musk. In some ways, professional wrestling was an analog AI for maximizing engagement at the expense of authenticity.
Boy, that is brilliant. I had not thought about that ever. But I think you're exactly right. And, in some sense, you can forgive professional wrestling. It's just entertainment. And they can make up the reality they want, and everybody can go along like knowing it's all a show and still being really impressed and excited to watch it. But I think you're right that somebody who gets to be very good at that, like the whole lie that is, and gets very good at sort of living that lie, doesn't find it to be difficult to basically adopt the same strategy in every other part of his life. Now, I actually think that, I think Donald Trump is like pathological in his capacity here. It just turns out that his capacity is enormously valuable in our time. Mm-hmm. But any other time in the history of modern society, he would have been a total loser because his inability to stay focused on reality and instead construct his own reality is a story that we've seen a million times. It's Ponzi. It's like every time it happens, eventually it blows up and like reality comes and slaps you down and you got to live with the consequences of that. I think people growing up at this age looking at reality are like, no, you don't pay the price. Like the question is how much you get away with, and you can get away with a lot. And especially when you're being rewarded for how crazy your ideas are, you can get away with an extraordinary amount. So obviously Kanye is not part of this government, at least not yet. But, think about this government. You have President Trump, you have Elon Musk, and you have RFK Jr., the three most prominent fantasists in modern society, all of them succeeding. Obviously Elon is succeeding as well because of his enormous success in a bunch of different businesses. But right now, he is painting fantasist world just as effectively as Trump does, and RFK too, like making up stuff to terrify people about vaccines or terrify them about fluoride in the water. And you're like, what happened? How did we, as a society, lose the capacity to just push these people aside because they don't live in reality? And yet, we will live in the reality that they construct.
Well, that's why I was so interested in talking to you about this article, Age of the Fantasist, because I think you laid it out exactly how it happened. You brought up three things. One is this editor-free, user-generated content. Another is data that allows Google and also the newspapers to know exactly how to market to you to get the most engagement and the most addiction, right? And then the last one is the fractured choruses.
Yeah. So I wrote this piece. I don't remember. I think it was last fall I was writing this piece. If you want to get the book version of this piece, René DiResta's book, Invisible Rulers, is a really powerfully fantastic unpacking of basically the same story. So, she says the reality we have right now is you've got influencers, you've got algorithms, and you have an audience. And the influencers are trying to maximize their wealth or influence. And the algorithms are trying to match them with the audience that will be most responsive to whatever they're trying to say. And so the influencers get to be very good at figuring out what they need to say to assure that their audience stays around. And that mix, of course, unconstrained by reality, is toxic. It's toxic for a society. It would be bad enough if we were just talking about influences on the internet, but the idea that the same dynamic produces a person who wins the election of president twice is terrifying because it's just going to shift everybody into the mode of behaving in the same way. It's either making stuff up, or it's like defamatory, or it's, because the algorithms aren't going to allow it to go viral unless it has some of these poisons attached to it.
This brings me to this quote. It comes after you say it's even more bleak than we think. And you say, the problem today is not just that we are divided. The problem is that the business model of media profits the more we are divided. The business model of hate in a world of engagement-based media is more profitable than a business model of understanding or moderation.
Mark Zuckerberg is not trying to ruin American democracy. That's not his objective. His objective is to maximize engagement. And he maximizes engagement by having a platform that figures out exactly, its AI figures out exactly what it needs to do to get you engaged. If the byproduct of that happens to destroy democracy, well, from Elon Musk's perspective, that's okay. Their objective is to maximize shareholder value. They're not responsible for what happens if they're maximizing shareholder value. Andrew Bosworth, who was one of the leading executives at Facebook, in the end of December 2019, just before the 2020 election, gave a speech to all of Facebook. And they were talking about the upcoming election and the anxiety that many of the Facebook employees had about their responsibility in 2016. And Andrew Bosworth invoked a book, Salt, Sugar, Fat, by Michael Moss. And in Salt, Sugar, Fat, Michael Moss talks about the processed food industry. These companies would discover that the food that's most addictive is also the most unhealthy food. And then you would have these moments where there would be executives who would kind of wake up with a conscience. And they would say, holy shit, this is terrible. Like, we ought to figure out how to make healthy food. And so they would try to make healthy food, or food that was not as unhealthy. And of course, the market would hate it, and then companies would go back to their old ways. Andrew Bosworth invokes this story as a way to explain why Facebook has no choice. Like, the market is going to force them to do whatever the market's going to force them to do. And it's not the job of the company to try to do anything better. We're screwed if that's reality, and there is no government that can do anything about it.
You know, you quote Jaron Lanier saying that the difference between engagement and addiction is really hard to parse. And you also mentioned there were studies that showed that there's kind of like a dopamine hit when you get more likes or something, you get more views. You write, the fantasist doesn't worry that he will not please everyone. He's not aiming for everyone. Indeed, he is aiming precisely to avoid appealing to everyone. Division drives attention in a world of fragmented media.
Jared's piece about, I think the word he uses is Twitter poison.
Yeah.
He talks about these people who become poisoned by their experience on Twitter. Like, you take, decent people who begin to spend all this time on Twitter, or X, whatever you want to call it, and they are reacting to the dopamine hits they're getting because of their stuff being retweeted or reacted to. And that just bends them in favor of what those algorithms tell them to do. I mean, I've seen it with my colleagues. Some of them, you look at them on Twitter and you're like, whoa, who is that person? But you can see that they're being that person because that person is a person who gets reshared 40,000 times. But the point is, it's hard to know psychologically how you're developing because of this constant feedback. It's just literally unhealthy, not just unhealthy for our democracy, it's unhealthy for the people who become obsessed in this way.
And you also mentioned that even back in the 1970s, or even from the 1950s, actually, you say that during certain hours when television was in prime time, the whole country was addicted. Well, in the 1950s, we all had to be there when Leave It to Beaver was on or whatever. And now the interaction is constant, right? That's just flowing into our brains all the time. We fall asleep to it.
Think back to the 1960s. Well, can't think back to it, but let's imagine, we understood what the 1960s and 1950s, 1970s even were like. You've got these businesses running these networks. They're not any more public spirited than businesses today. They just live in a different market environment. One important part of that market environment was government regulation. In 1961, Newt Minow gave a speech as the chairman of the FCC and talked about the vast wasteland of television. And he basically threatened television stations. He said, if you guys don't clean up your act and start producing publicly responsible content, we're going to revoke your licenses. And at that time, they were terrified that he was going to revoke their licenses. So they conspired to basically put news at the same time slot on every major network so that nobody would lose competitively if they were covering the news. But once television delivers news at the same time to everybody, all of a sudden, everybody has a deeper understanding of what's going on in the world around them. Now, it's not like overwhelming. Like, it's only for, a half an hour a day. It's not like you're going to get much. Didn't cover a whole bunch of issues that should have been covered. I'm not saying there was a golden age. I'm just saying there was an age where we were all on the same page at the same time in the kind of 1960 to 1985 period. It had an enormous effect on democracy. This is work, I draw this from the work of Marcus Pryor, Princeton political scientist, who has the numbers, has the data. He can demonstrate how as television begins to penetrate different markets, people are more engaged, they understand issues in a more comprehensive way. And you can think about the enormous progress we as a society made over that period of time. We wrestled with incredibly difficult issues, whether it's racism or Vietnam or environmental concerns or Richard Nixon. These were hard social issues that we had to struggle through, but we could struggle through as a people because, in a sense, we were all in the same schoolroom at the same time. So the business model today is not about understanding. It's not about bringing us to the same place. The business model today for cable, for broadcasting, has become about turning us into partisans and rallying us as partisans. And that alone would not be the end of things, because that alone would still have editors who would make a judgment about whether you're going to include a certain person on your television station. But once you remove the editor, once you remove a human and you just hand it over to the algorithm, who's deciding who gets access on the basis of who's getting the most attention, that turns out to select for a radically different group of people. And the consequence of that is devastating. It's not just who gets selected in media context. It's who gets selected in contexts that depend upon media. So if you compare congressmen from the 1960s and 1970s, there's basically boring white men. But many of them were deeply interested in important areas of policy. So you would have guys that would go to Congress, they were obsessed with the auto industry. There are guys who were obsessed with the environment or clean water. There are people who are obsessed with policy judgments, and that's what they did 18 months out of every 2-year cycle. Now, the people who this system selects for are basically clowns. I mean, I'm not saying I disagree with what they say, but I am saying they succeed because they are partisan and extreme in a way that just would not have worked 30 or 40 years ago. And this is a byproduct of a media ecosystem that's just looking for the people who are going to get people most excited to watch their content. So that's what gets them the attention, regardless of how crazy they might be. Well, it's not a way to run a democracy, and it's not clear we're going to be able to run a democracy for many more cycles unless we figure out a way to address this problem.
So my wife noticed that my mom is watching AI stories about Caitlin Clark. They're not voiced by a human. It's a little too smooth.
The decision to leave Caitlin Clark off the Paris Olympics roster became one of 2024's most debated sports topics.
After hitting the three, she ran back on defense while shushing the crowd that had gained excitement after the Clark three. She should have known that Clark was going to be coming for her, though, because she always does.
The algorithm tells the computer to make it more and more driven by conflict. So it's become Caitlin Clark versus the African-American WNBA.
I mean, this was not just a random act of violence directed at CC.
It's just like professional wrestling. Somehow AI has learned that we go back for the cheap calories or the empty calories of conflict. In this basketball thing, it has to do with race and also competition on the court. But, basically every basketball game is now a grudge match.
Yeah, and we're just vulnerable to what works.
Yeah.
That's quite tragic for some people. So my middle child is trans. And I gave a talk 2 years ago at the Nantucket Project about the way trans issues were spreading through society. And I told this story about this conservative couple that I'd met at a camp. And they were describing how their daughter was adopted and she turned out to be trans. And so the mother was describing how she worked with everybody in the little town that they lived in to coordinate a Pride Flag Day. So at 8 o'clock in the morning on a certain day, all across the town, these pride flags went up like daylilies. And the father gave this talk and he said, I look like the, central casting version of a MAGA Republican. I drive a truck. I've got a rifle rack in the back. All of my buddies drive trucks with rifle racks in the back. He said, but every one of my buddies would do whatever it took to protect my daughter, because that's just the kind of people they are. And that story just moved me so, because I thought, wow, this issue is going to somehow bypass the whole political framing that would exploit it to turn people against each other. Well, how naive could I be? Because, here in the United States, we've got this, we had this election where one of the most compelling ads, $160 million spent on this ad, was, all these images of Kamala Harris talking about trans rights. And the last punchline was, she's for they, them, he's for you. And so you're going to see the Republican Party increasingly ratcheting up the need to express their hatred, framed as however they want to frame it. But the consequence will be an enormous number of, kids especially, who will suffer because of this. There was a massive study done showing that when states adopt anti-trans laws, the number of attempted suicides by kids under 18 rises by 72%. To take a vulnerable group and turn them into the pariah, the social pariah, and then therefore lead many of them to self-harm or violence against them, this is how you're going to win elections, then, shame on you. But the point that you just made earlier, there's no shame in this world. They win elections. Their media world constructs a bunch of people who follow and understand that media in that way. And they profit. They get a return from that. And that reality is just a function of what turns out to engage us the most. That might be fine in a fantasy world or in professional wrestling. That might be just fine. But when it's democracy and society and vulnerable people who are going to be beaten up or killed based on this hate, it's not fine.
And what really got me scared from reading your article and actually watching your TED Talk even more is that now algorithms are doing it. Robots can do it so much faster. I'm going to have to edit this together. It's going to take me hours. Right now, robots are making things to make my mom hate black basketball players. As fast as, I don't know how long it takes, but it's probably 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Let me just quote you once again. You say, the way out begins with the discipline to resist the algorithmic temptations designed to capture us, not to inform us.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of hopeful speaking. I don't know that we're able to resist it. I think it's even worse than that. We don't want to resist it. I had a great little program called Read Across that would watch what you read on your phone, and then you could go to that app and it would give you stuff on the other side. I hated it. I just hated it. I was like, I don't want to waste my time reading this crap. I want to read what I want to read. So the point is, at some level, you can reflect and say, geez, it would be great if I expose myself across the rim. But, we only have so many hours in a day, and we got to get our hits. So we're going to take what we can get. So I think that it's true that we need to become critical and aware of exactly how we're all being misled. For me, the solution, if there is one, and it's hard to see how this scales quickly enough, but is to really revert to forms of democracy where, it's kind of at human scale. So citizen assemblies is something that's exploding all around the world, just beginning in the United States, where people of different views are randomly selected. They're brought together to talk about some particular issue. The experience of first of all, learning something and something that's balanced, giving you information in a balanced way up front, and then sitting with people you disagree with and talking through the issue with those people. You learn these people are not reptiles. They are people just like you. They have kids. They have futures. They want just like yours. It's really a healing process. It's a process to make you believe once again in the possibility, the real opportunity to make democracy work. And I feel like we need to multiply those experiences so we can begin to have a clear sense of the difference between democracy done at human scale, at human speed, and democracy done at Twitter scale and at Twitter speed. Mm-hmm. There's a movement called the slow democracy movement, like the slow food movement. Slow food movement says if you just cook your food and eat it with friends, you'll be fine. You can't cook poisonous food like processed food companies do. And if you eat it slowly, your body will handle it. So let's make food fit to human bodies. Slow democracy says if we slow it down, give people a chance to just talk to each other, the thing we've been doing for hundreds of thousands of years, just talk to each other. Then the outcome of that is something we can respect. And I feel like We've got to find ways to expand the slow democracy movement. But I'm not sure that we have, the deep pessimistic view is that might be the answer, but it's not clear we have time.
We have a mutual friend, Cenk Uygur.
Yes.
In fact, one of the first times I ever met you was at a constitutional convention, a convention to have a mock constitutional
Yeah, in
convention.
2011 here at Harvard.
And actually before that, we did that once down in Tennessee. But I wonder, if you've noticed about Cenk, that he's the closest thing the left has to that pugilistic kind of professional wrestling. I'm not saying he's unmoored from the facts. He's very, very devoted to the facts. But there's sort of an angry kind of tone to not only him, but the other people in his stable. And the Australian political scientist students that I interviewed, they basically said the only thing that can get America out of this Trump addiction is someone like him, but from the left.
Well, I have enormous respect for Cenk and his insights. And I don't think there's a couple issues we disagree about.
Well, I'm not necessarily saying he should be the candidate. In fact, what the one they recommended was Mark Cuban. But the general idea is we're never going to be able to change any of this media landscape. So we have to basically build a ship that navigates it.
Yeah. Well, I'm working on a piece right now. It's supposed to have been finished, but I hope to be finished by the end of the week. That, says the Democrats failed by not understanding what populism is about. And populism is not about left versus right. Populism is about inside versus outside. So to the extent populism is about outsiders, Trump won because he was that, and he will no longer be the Republican nominee, assuming the Constitution still survives. And so we don't have to worry about that. But then you look in the Democratic side and you say, who are the outsider Democrats? And literally the only one is Mark Cuban. Cenk is, but Cenk can't run because the Constitution has been interpreted to say Cenk's not qualified. But Mark Cuban is kind of a better version of Trump. He was a more successful business person. And the advantage to him is that he's actually tied to reality. He says smart and sensible things. So I would say, if the logic of writing this piece, I was getting it to the end saying, holy shit, I guess I'm for Mark Cuban, because only Mark Cuban could embrace the populist view on the left and push it in a way that could rally the outsiders to say, finally, there's somebody who gets it. But here's Mark Cuban's problem. Mark Cuban doesn't talk about the issues that actually unite us. The issues that unite us are the issues Cenk talks about. Corruption, money in politics. The whole system is just broken. The anti-establishment rant about how all the insiders are just trying to make it good for them. And I think if Cuban spoke about that, or if some outsider could credibly talk about that, we have an enormous opportunity in 2028. It's almost like the pieces have been put in place in a magical way. Because the difference between today and 20 years ago, when I started doing this work on corruption and money in politics, is 20 years ago, people didn't get it. They didn't think the system was corrupt. Now, everybody gets it. So I think that if people like Mark Cuban were to begin to rally around this point, this administration is going to be a gift to that argument. Because the one thing we know about the Trump administration that's about to happen is that it will be the most kleptocratic administration since the last Trump administration. The whole game of tariffs, that game is just about being able to bring executives into the Oval Office and saying to them, okay, I'll give you an exemption. What are you going to do for me? That's what they did in the last Trump administration. The academic studies that look about how the tariffs were played find one thread explains the variance. That is ties to the Republican Party. So there's going to be a million examples of corruption to point to. And if you begin to rally the Democratic base and then the other people who are accessible to the Democratic side to this idea that we actually have a solution, we're going to actually solve this problem of corruption. We're actually going to take money and politics out of the system. And look at those guys. So I think the Cuban strategy is a brilliant one right now. If he could only be brought around to focus on the thing he needs to focus on, to be a genuine outsider, you ought to be hanging with Cenk, listening to Cenk talk about everything. He shouldn't be as angry as Cenk, because I think Cenk is great for media, but that's not going to be the thing that's going to bring people around. And let's hope that somebody sees this and does and acts on it.
Wrestling Darkness is written, recorded, and edited by yours truly, Eric Byler. The music is composed by Michael Brook, while this jazzy improv rendition you are hearing now was performed by David Beninay and Stephen Munoz. Wrestling Darkness and other content you will find on the Eric Byler Substack feed are supported by a 501c3 nonprofit called ID Alliance. You can support us by subscribing or by making a tax-deductible donation. Thanks for listening.